As many of you in the RWBY fandom are probably already aware, a few weeks back we got an addition to the RWBY storyline in the form of a book, After the Fall. And for those of you who weren't aware, this book follows Team Coffee, consisting of Coco, Fox, Yatsuhashi, and Velvet. They were a second-year team at Beacon Academy, who was, a year ahead of Team RWBY, and we saw them briefly in volumes 2 and 3, but haven't seen them at all since then. This book takes place a year and a bit after the fall of Beacon Academy. Team Coffee is now enrolled at Shade Academy in Vacuo, and follows, for a majority of the book at least, a mission that Team Coffee was on in Vacuo, and this mission has some implications for the future of the RWBY storyline. By the time the show actually gets to Vacuo, things could have progressed even further. Characters introduced in this book might have impact on the RWBY storyline in general, connections to other characters we have already met, things along those lines. There's a lot that we can learn from this book, and I highly recommend it to anyone who's a fan of the RWBY series. It has a little bit in there for everyone, and there's plenty of videos I plan on making off of it, noted by the amount of things that I've slotted in here. But we learn more about new types of Grimm. We learn about Vacuo. We learn a lot about, of course, Team Coffee, including their fighting styles and semblances, which, admittedly, I did not know anything really about other than what I had seen in the show before this. Now, if you're anything like me, you probably didn't watch the Volume 3 director's commentary for the DVD and Blu-ray releases, and didn't really learn that much about their semblances and anything like that. So, if you want to learn about that, I highly recommend this book for anyone who's a fan of Team Coffee or the RWBY series. Even if you're only a fan of the Beacon Academy days, this book has 7 or 8 chapters, I believe, going back to when Coffee was enrolled at Beacon Academy. Their initiation in the Emerald Forest, how they encountered Team RWBY for the first time, and how they grew closer to that team. And also a past mission that Team Coffee was on that had a major impact on how the team handles situations throughout the book. It's very well written and is just a very good book. Today's video, though, I want to go over the mission that Team Coffee is on in Vacuo and the implications that it has for the future storyline of RWBY. So I will say spoiler warning for those who want to read the book and go in spoiler-free. I'm going to spoil pretty much the entire plot of the mission, as I'm going to go over everything in relatively good detail so you can get an idea of what's happening in the overall plot, how things played out, and then at the end go over the analysis of what exactly the implications will be. So, without further ado, let's get into a little bit of the Vacuum environment and the mission that Team Coffee is on. So we start off, they're of course in the desert, out on a mission going to one of the settlements, but they are having a slight problem with the wildlife of the desert. Not something you really think of in the desert, where nutrients aren't really that abundant, and yet in Vacuo the wildlife seems to be a problem. Not Grimm, just the regular wildlife. They're having trouble with mole crabs. Crabs where the babies of the species are as big as they are. So yeah, they're having a little bit of a run-in with them, and they even do run into an adult where it's big enough that Velvet has to bore into its stomach to defeat it, and then has to physically climb out of it. So yeah, kind of giant crabs that they have to fight. And the wildlife in Vacuo gets a little bit stranger even after that point. But after they defeat the crabs, they find a woman who is stranded by them, and she is, I wouldn't necessarily say elderly, maybe elderly for Remnant, I think probably around 50 or so, and her name is Slate. They find out that she was part of a refugee company coming from a settlement called Gosan, and they were headed towards Feldspar. Team Coffee, in fact, got a distress signal from Gosan, and they were headed to Feldspar to meet up with the refugees, and just happened upon Slate. So they end up traveling together to Feldspar and find out that Slate is actually the mayor of the refugees. But she wasn't the mayor of Gosan. Well, I guess she was, but that wasn't what she was initially the mayor of. She was a mayor of the Tough settlement, which, with those people, they got overrun by Grimm as well. So she was the mayor of Tough. Everyone had to flee to the Schist settlement. Then the Schist settlement got overrun. Then they had to flee to Gosan. The Gosan got overrun. Then they had to flee to Feldspar. So a little bit of a pattern here. And we find out as they're talking to one another, Team Coffee is talking to Slate, that normally in Vacuo, same as any other place, but maybe a little bit more with the heat and everything wearing on people's emotions, things get, for lack of a better word, heated. People get angry, get into arguments, maybe a Grimm or two would come, but they'd be able to be defeated, and no one would have to up and abandon their homes. Now, the way Vacuo is set up, people are just in little settlements with, you know, tents and little huts that they can tear down and take with them at a moment's notice in case a grim attack comes. But lately, people's emotions have started to snowball. If someone gets a little bit angry, it has the potential to just keep growing and growing until the entire town is pissed at each other, and then enough grim come to overrun the entire settlement, and then they have to flee. This has already happened 3 times already. So how exactly did everyone survive? Well, luckily, there have been 2 huntsmen that have been traveling with the refugees and the nomads of these different settlements, protecting them against the grim. And we meet these huntsmen, Bertolac and Carmen. Now, Bertolac, we don't actually have an image for. We didn't get a picture of him anywhere, but he's easy enough to be described as someone who's Yatsuhashi's build. He's 6'6", dark-skinned, except he's got a green mohawk, a green goatee. He does wear some green armor, like a green chest plate, and wields a chain mace with a gun in the hilt. So, yeah, he's pretty intimidating guy. He's huge and not the nicest one to be around. He looks down on Team Coffee for being, you know, novice huntsman, just huntsman in training, things like that. So he's got a little bit of a mouth on him, and people aren't really that fond of him right out of the gate. But his partner, Carmen, is quite the opposite. She is a bit shorter than Bertolac, you know, 6'6". Most people are shorter than him. But she's got red hair. We do have an image for her, actually, thanks to Amity Arena. She's got red hair, dark skin, chainmail tank top, and short shorts. You know, even Coco was attracted to her right at the beginning. So, yeah. And thanks to Amity Arena, we do have the image for her. I believe Team Coffee was added along with her to support the release of After the Fall. I don't actually play Amity Arena, but, you know, you guys might already know her from there if you guys do play. And she kind of keeps Bertolac under control to some degree. And these 2 huntsmen, the only reason they're there is because they were hired by 2 people. The Caspians, who are actually refugees from Vale. And they hired Bertolac and Carmen to escort them. And they've been traveling with them ever since because they can actually protect the people there. But since Bertolac and Carmen were hired by the Caspians, they really have no interest in helping the rest of the settlements. You know, nice guy Bertolac. But Team Coffee, they're there, and they do vow to get to the bottom of it. They say, we'll help, we'll see what's going on and try to figure out what's happening. Because something is happening as they're witnessing fights starting to break out in just the little bar that they're in. So they go around, interview all the different townsfolk, and everyone pretty much has the same story. Emotions just, they start getting angry, like a baby was crying, and they'd start getting agitated. Then it turned to anger, and then once they realized their anger was building so much, it turned to sadness, because they didn't want to hurt the child, and things like that. Similar stories were everywhere, and there didn't really seem to be a common element. Until, when they all came together and shared their information, Velvet realized these attacks started in Tough. You know, only a couple days after the Caspians got there. Maybe there's a connection, because they've been happening ever since, and the Caspians have been traveling with them ever since. So yeah, they put 2 and 2 together, so they decided to go talk to the Caspians, someone who Bertolac and Carmen were kind of keeping away from the public at that point, protecting them from being talked to. However, Coco and Fox are able to lure them away, so Yatsuhashi and Velvet can go talk to them, and we meet the Caspians. Gus, or August, a young boy, about 8 or 10, I believe, and his grandfather, Edward, who is a 70-year-old retired huntsman. Not something you hear every day in the world of Remnant. He's someone who has hunted a majority of his life and has lived to tell about it. Now, Remnant's not a very forgiving place, and we don't see that very often. We did see, of course, Maria Calavera, who's an elderly person who was once a huntsman as well, but I don't really know how much she hunted after she got blinded, which happened very young in her life, so, you know, and hey, potentially if they meet each other, if Maria survives through Atlas and everything, that could be someone that they have something to talk about in future, I don't know, but we'll see what ends up happening there. Throughout this conversation, though, we find that Gus and Edward are from Sumere, a village in Vale that had been attacked by Grimm, and in which August's parents, Edward's daughter and his daughter's husband, had perished in that attack. And they were able to find Bertolac and Carmen, who were passing through, hire them to guide them through Vacuo to a place where they can be isolated from everyone. Kind of strange, but, you know, it's makes sense later on. Now, Edward had said throughout this conversation that he wanted everyone to stay together because, you know, they don't have the money to buy huntsmen to protect themselves, so they wanted to stick with the group and not keep moving on. But also throughout this conversation, Edward wasn't necessarily there. He's an old man and times were weighing on him. He would phase out of the conversation. You could be talking directly to him and he wouldn't even act like he was there. He was just gone in his own mind and then pop back into the conversation. So there was a little bit of dementia, Alzheimer's, things like that that was happening. And while he was in one of those, you know, talking to August and bringing up, you know, his parents being killed, things like that, emotions got a little bit high as well. And then the Grimm came. There was a small attack by Grimm, and Team Coffee, Bertolac Carmen, was able to fend the Grimm off without too much difficulty. No one died or anything like that. And then they decided to come up with a plan. Why don't we just all split up into smaller groups, stay close to the relay tower, because there are still towers available from the CCT that can relay with Shade Academy, just not, you know, other continents, so they can still keep in contact with each other, but see where the Grimm would be attracted to. One huntsman for each of these little groups. But Team Coffee and Edward are in agreement at this point, saying, no, sticking together would be much easier to defend. One group of people for 6 huntsmen versus 1 huntsman for smaller groups of people, you know, tactics and whatnot. So they end up staying together, and that following night, it seems Edward also has another slight issue. He has a tendency to sleepwalk. So he ends up walking out of the settlement, because the settlement does have, because Feldspar is an actual settlement that is more in ground, so it has fences and everything around it, but he goes for a sleepwalk in the middle of the night, out into the middle of the desert. Luckily, Velvet was watching him and wandered after him to see where the hell he was going. Fox picked up on this and ran to join her as well. And they ran into a King Taijitu out in the desert. So Velvet and Fox had to fight that thing in the dark while also protecting an old man who's still unconscious at this point. So yeah, that was an interesting little encounter. They did end up winning. Fox almost sacrificed himself at that point, but luckily didn't have to. And then Edward woke up, wondered, you know, where the hell is he? He needed to get back to the town, wondered where Gus was, confused, everything like that. Bertolac also came running out to greet them, saying, "Where the hell have you been, old man? The hell are you thinking?" You know, pissy. Not the nicest guy. At this point, everyone goes back to the Caspian's hut, and Edward and Gus kind of have a little talk. Gus starts freaking out when they bring his grandfather back, saying that it's all my fault. Everything is my fault, and starts getting very emotional. Even the Grimm attacks, he's saying, are his fault. So at this point, we get a little bit of an explanation, and things start to make sense. Gus says that Edward's semblance is to increase people's emotions. Something that would be very problematic in a large group of people. But fortunately, Gus's semblance is to block other people's semblances. A hell of a useful semblance in any situation, really. And so, since Edward is kind of, you know, not really in control, his semblance is kind of going haywire, thus increasing people's emotions when he doesn't mean to. And Gus, unfortunately, since he's only very young, can't really control his semblance that well either, so at times when he wants to control his grandfather's semblance, he's not able to, and that leads to what he calls the mood bombs, where emotions just build and then, boom, the Grimm come. At this point, though, Bertolac and Carmen are getting pissed off. Everyone's a little bit surprised. It seems like Bertolac and Carmen are just acting, though, as they probably knew about this since they were guiding them to solitude to begin with. But yeah, things get pretty heated, and guess what comes again? An even larger attack of Grimm, with many different kinds and many more of them. And Feldspar is overrun. They've been there for maybe a day, 2 days, and it's already overrun. Everyone has to flee the village. Velvet, Bertolac, and Carmen go with the group of refugees. Fox, Yatsuhashi, and Coco decide to lead the Grimm off in a different direction to save the refugees the trouble. They do that and succeed. Luckily, no one really dies in the attack, at least not mentioned in the book. Maybe a few of the Residents of Feldspar did end up perishing, but I'm not really sure. Then as Coco, Yatsuhashi, and Fox are making their way back to reconnect with the refugees from the settlement, they realize that there was a branching path, that a couple people seem to have strayed off from the path that the refugees took. So Fox decides to go after them. Coco and Yatsuhashi go to meet up with Velvet. And when they do, they hear from Velvet that they haven't seen Bertolac or Edward for some time. So we cut back to Fox, and guess who he ends up finding? Well, he's running out in the desert and finds Edward huddled over and almost buried in the sand, as, you know, the desert, with the desert winds, tends to, if anything's on the ground, cover it up quite quickly, but he is able to find him. And after doing so, Edward's not really in his right mind at that moment. He actually lashes out at Fox, seeing him as an enemy, and Fox ends up having to fight the old man. Now, he may be old, but he's still a retired huntsman, so he can put up a pretty good fight. And Fox, although does have some trouble, he is able to knock the guy on his back and knock some sense into him. And when he comes to his senses, he recognizes Fox, that he's seen him before, and is saying to him, "We need to get back. We need to get back to Gus. We need to get back." And then Fox realizes that what Gus said was actually a lie. It's not actually that Edward's semblance increases people's emotions. It's the reverse. Gus is the one who increases people's emotions, and Edward is the one who blocks him. Ever since Gus's parents had died, he lost control of his semblance. His emotions have been getting out of control, and thus his semblance has been causing other people's emotions to get out of control as well. And since Edward isn't in his right mind, he's not able to block it as well as he should. In fact, it was Edward who sent out the distress call from Gosen after he realized that Bertolac and Carmen weren't leading him in the right direction. They were leading him somewhere else after they had found out what Edward and Gus's semblance could do. At this point, though, Bertolac jumps in and just rocks Fox. Now, it's Fox and Edward versus Bertolac. 6'6", giant muscly dude. It's a hell of a more difficult fight for both of them. Fox is even knocked out for a couple seconds during the fight, and Edward is able to hold his own, and they are able to eventually knock Bertolac out, but it took a toll on both of them. They check his scroll and see that he did send a message to Carmen a few minutes back saying that Edward is useless, Gus is the one we want, take the kid and run, essentially. So yeah, little bit of a problem. Bertolac and Carmen are actually enemies at this point, and Fox needs to get Edward and is going to drag Bertolac all the way back to meet up with the refugees. But the refugees aren't really having that great a time either, as a sandstorm is on its way, and they decide to make a beeline for some canyons, but are not going to make it in time. Velvet happens to spot a plateau not that far in the distance that, they're gonna make a run for that instead. But Slate realizes that that's not a plateau, that's a sand turtle, or I believe it's a turtle, but I forget what actual name they used for it, but it's a giant turtle. The sandstorm is about 60 meters high, they approximate, and also the sandstorm is the reason that Fox can't contact the rest of his team to tell them, hey, Bertolac and Carmen are the enemy, watch out for Carmen. So there's also that little issue there. But sandstorm is about 60 meters high. This turtle is 100 meters high. Wildlife in vacuo. Apparently it's just bigger than anywhere else. The only other real wildlife we've seen is in the flashback when in Salem and Ozpin's past, where there's some deer and things like that, and then Zwei, I wouldn't really count as wildlife, but other than that, there's not been much wildlife other than a few birds here and there, crow. But anyways, they decide to make a beeline for that turtle because they can climb onto its shell and just avoid the sandstorm. So that's what they head over to do, and as they get there, Velvet climbs up, sees that there are tents and actual pegs in the turtle's shell where people have climbed up before. So they are able to throw down a few ropes and people can start climbing up. However, during this, fights start breaking out. People's emotions start ramping and things aren't turning out that well. And then they see in front of the turtle is the big Grimm that we're introduced to in this book. We're introduced to many others, but I'll cover those in a different video, including this one, which is known as the blind worm. It's a giant worm that I can only describe, the best way I can describe it, if you play Magic the Gathering, there's a card named Wormcoil Engine. It's essentially that in Grimm form. It's a giant worm that coils through the sand and can move very, very fast. Now, everyone is climbing up the turtle, and they realize, as everyone gets to the top, Yatsuhashi and Coco are the last ones up. Velvet said, where's Gus? Where's Carmen? I haven't seen either of them. Neither did Coco and Yatsuhashi. Uh-oh, it looks like they were actually, or Carmen actually took Gus, and now there's this giant blind worm that they have to deal with. So they say, okay, they spot a little tuft of sand that's out in the desert on the opposite side of the turtle, and they say, well, that's probably Carmen. They see through the sand that Carmen is there running with Gus, and that's where they need to go to, get Gus back. Yatsuhashi ends up running after them, while Coco and Velvet stay to deal with this blind worm. And the blind worm is able to coil and jump over, or I guess not really jump, but soar over the turtle with ease, and is attacking both of them. Now, they are able to get in some strikes on the worm, but it has hard scales, and even the fleshy bits between it, if you slice that, we see that acid is spewing out. So you can't cut the thing, you can't damage the thing through its scales. This thing is really difficult for them to deal with, and at one point, Velvet kind of stumbled because the turtle itself is a living creature and doesn't really want to deal with the Grimm, so it's trying to avoid it, and when it shakes, Velvet almost falls off. Coco does end up saving her, but just as the worm is coming up, and Velvet is saved, but Coco does fall into the worm and is devoured by the Grimm. Luckily, though, she's devoured whole and is still alive inside this giant thing, so it is possible that people can survive within the Grimm if they're swallowed whole. So Roman Torchwick could be alive. Huh? It's possible. It's if that is canon, that you can survive inside of a Grimm without being devoured immediately, and you've been swallowed whole, like Torchwick was, like Coco was, you can survive. It's possible. But anyways, while in the blind worm, Coco is able to get back on her scroll and get in contact with her teammates outside. At this point, the blind worm has turned its attention towards Yatsuhashi as he was fighting Carmen. At this point, Fox has also been able to reconnect with the group, get closer to them, and has joined in on the fray. And Yatsuhashi tells Coco, get to the far end of the worm, essentially the ass end of the worm, as close as you can get. She does this, and he's able to actually slice off the back end of the worm and save Coco. Carmen is then bested as well, with a little bit of help from another team that ends up showing up at the end of the book, reconnects with Team Coffee. Team Sun has shown up, and they reconnect with Team Coffee, and they say at the end of the book that they have some things to discuss. So now Team Coffee is going to know everything that happened up until the end of Haven Academy, because Sun and Neptune were traveling with them at that point. So, yeah, everyone is reconnecting in Vacuo, Team Sun, Team Coffee, and this is where the novel ends off. So we know that once Team RWBY finishes up at Atlas, they're going to be able to go there, reconnect with Team Coffee, Team Sun, and snowball from there. Hear the different stories that the different teams have gone through, and also find out the information that the other teams don't have. Now that Bertilac and Carmen are in custody, though, we find out that they were hired by a certain employer. We still don't know the name of that employer, but their job was to seek out those with strong semblances and bring them to that employer. Now, everyone, including the refugees, are going to be headed to Shade Academy now, and they're going to bring Bertilac and Carmen there. I don't know if they're going to get ambushed at that point, but still, there's a lot that this could potentially have. For example, as I mentioned before, and I'm really hoping, Roman Torchwick also leads more potential that he could still be alive somewhere in the world of Remnant, but that still might be a stretch. But the main point of this book that really resonates with me is that people can lose control of their semblances. When they get to older age, there's still dementia and things that weigh on people's minds that can cause them to lose control of their semblance. And if their semblance is lost control of their aura too. So that could lead to some problematic situations depending on what a person's semblance is. For example, if people's emotions can be raised just by someone losing slight control like that, and enough that Grimm would be drawn to overrun an entire city, not to mention if that semblance fell into the hands of, oh, I don't know, for example, if the employer was Salem, or an underling of Salem, and she's gathering people with strong semblances, then that overall war that is likely going to happen at the end of the RWBY series, possibly fought over the last relic, or if each faction has a different number of relics, then they're going to fight to see who gets all of them, something along those lines. It could lead to Salem having more than just Grimm and a few admirals in her army. If she's collecting a whole bunch of people that have strong semblances, not to mention has other huntsmen and huntresses on her payroll that we don't know about yet, that could lead a lot to what the future of RWBY holds. Not to mention, I'd like to believe, or I'm very inclined to believe, that Salem has other admins, I'm going to call them, in her faction as the table that is in her throne room. When we first see it at the Volume 4, and we see it in Volumes 5, and I believe Volume 6 as well, it has 6 chairs at it, sitting along the sides, 3 on each, and then Salem's throne at the head of the table. Only 4 of those chairs have been filled by Tyrion, Watts, Hazel, and Cinder. Those other 2 chairs were left empty. Now, I don't believe that it's actually Bertilac and Carmen who are the ones who sit in those chairs, as they were just hired by some employer to hunt down semblances, but I believe it's someone who Salem has trust in, one of her admirals who did outsource the job to other huntsmen and huntresses. That's what I believe actually happened, or it could be some other organization operating in Vacuo. Now, Vacuo is called the Lawless Country, so that could be the case, but it's not like everyone there is a cutthroat and a thief. More like there's just no laws to govern, and the one law that people mostly follow is, if it comes down to your life or someone else's, choose your own life and keep living. So that's essentially what they mean by Vacuo as the Lawless Country. We haven't seen Shade Academy or the giant city that surrounds it yet, so there could be an underground organization in there, similar to the Spider organization that Little Miss Malachite was in charge of, but we haven't really heard from her. She was in 1 episode in Volume 6 and then nothing else. If her organization is wide-reaching all the way to Vacuo, as well as, you know, Haven and Argus and other towns in Mistral? Yes. I need to learn the geography of Remnant a little bit better. But overall, there's a lot of implications that we can have for this. For example, like even August, if he is able to go to the academy, get control of his semblance, then like I don't know how useful his semblance would be as a hunter or huntress. I mean, if he could use his semblance in a way that could increase his own emotions and kind of aggro the Grimm towards himself to get it away from other people, civilians, and possibly lure them into a trap, that would be very useful. Edward's semblance could be very useful, being a retired huntsman, even though he's not in the greatest mind state. If he can get to a doctor in Shade, maybe there is medication in the world of Remnant that could help him, and maybe he'll become a professor at Shade Academy, or a mentor for someone on Team Coffee or Team Sun, potentially even Team Ruby or Juniper when they finally get there. Now, that is something that I think will play a role later on in the series. I think we will, in the series, meet Bertilac, Carmen, Edward, and August, maybe even Slate, as the series progresses towards Vacuo, and we see what Vacuo holds for us. So overall, hopefully you guys like this review. Let me know what your guys' thoughts are based on the book, if you've read it, or my ramblings about this. If you've watched this far into the video, I think it's probably over a half hour by now. I really appreciate it, as it kind of recorded this a few times just to make sure my words are straight. I haven't missed anything throughout all the things I've been saying about this novel, so I really appreciate you guys. There are more videos to come based on this book later in the summer, based on other things in the RWBY series, so look forward to those. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you guys look forward to more. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe so you can be notified when those videos go up. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next one.